Okay, this is Dan Fowler, and we are having technical difficulties, and we'll be on pretty quickly here. We really got a major announcement to make, a new law that was passed last night that's going to affect everybody who owns an apartment building. And so you'll want to get the information. Dennis has all that for us, the new law that was passed last night, and he'll be giving you that information when we get on. But because of the virus that we have here, I'm just kidding, because of technical difficulties, we're not on yet. Please hold on, folks. Hi, my name is Dan Fowler, and we have a webinar here, how to survive the free rent problem that we have today. And we have some announcements to make to you that free rent is going to have even more meaning for many tenants out there because of new laws that have just recently been passed last night. Dennis Block will be coming on to tell you about those new laws. If you have somebody in your company who collects rents and who's involved here, or friends who are apartment owners, you may want to get them on the line for when Dennis comes on to explain the new law that's taken place. Also, on the home page of the AOAUSA.com, over on the left-hand side, scroll down a little bit. On the left-hand side is a petition. After you hear what happens, you're going to want to sign that petition, get it out to some other people, and at least 5 other friends of yours. Most of you have more friends than that, and ask them to sign that petition for you that we'll be presenting to the governor. Also, the letters and all forms that you're going to need when you're asking your tenants to sign a note. Those notes and a letter to give your tenants are on the AOA website. You can download those for free. Also, on the petition, there's a place to donate, and you may want to give a donation at the end of that. We have some real battles coming up, as you know. In November, they're going to try to take away vacancy decontrol if everything is back to normal at that time. We have a big, expensive battle that's coming up, and we're going to want to win this again, just like we won 10. But it's going to take a lot of money to do that. There's a couple things that every one of us ought to practice out there. And that's when we're talking to our friends and we're explaining rent control. And they think, well, what's wrong with rent control? All they're doing is keeping the rents low and not allowing you to raise them, and rents are too high anyway. Well, actually, we'd like to get a new term in here and not call it rent control, but call it tenant welfare, because that's what it is. You're saying, what do you mean? It's tenant welfare. Your friend will say to you, who is not an apartment owner, you say, well, you have an apartment, a tenant. He's paying $1,000 a month. And the apartment is worth, it's a one-bedroom apartment, it's worth $1,500 a month. How much money of welfare is that tenant receiving? He is receiving $1,500 item each month, and he's only paying $1,000. That $500 is the amount of welfare that tenant is receiving. And the problem here, it's not coming from society as welfare normally comes from. It's coming from one owner. If that one owner owns 10 units, that he's providing welfare for 10 families. Not fair, folks, and you want to express that to the politicians. You want to send your letters to the governor, to your local mayor in your city, and tell them about that. Tell them it's tenant welfare. They need to pay for it. Society needs to pay for a welfare out of that. Another reason, we have a housing crisis. Why do we have a housing crisis? Well, because the politicians have been draining money out of the housing industry for the last 40 years here in California. You say, well, how do they drain money out of it? Well, housing providers do one thing. They provide housing. And after they provide housing, they provide more housing. However, if you take the money away from them, they are not going to provide more housing. Tenants are consumers. They consume housing. The politicians give rent control. They're giving that money to the tenant. They consume it, which is what you expect of them, but it takes it out of the hands of housing providers and builders. As a result of that, you have less housing. It's kind of a duh thing. If you can't figure it out, you don't know why we have a housing crisis. It's because money has been drained out. And the laws that we're passing and the laws that was passed last night, the rules that were passed last night are going to drive the builders out of this state, and this housing crisis is going to be even worse than it was going to be. If the politicians think it was bad before, it's going to be worse after passing all these laws and taking away our property rights. Again, I want to encourage you to sign that petition. Go on the website, sign the petition. We're going to come out with a petition number 2 here in the next couple of weeks. So when you get a second petition, be sure to sign that and get everybody to sign it. Basically, on that petition, we're going to be asking the government to give the tenants vouchers, rental vouchers, so that they'll be able to pay their rent. And it'll be paid by society, by the government. Those vouchers could be a grant, or they could be a loan to the tenant. That's up to the city councils, that's up to the governor, what he wants to do. But we're asking the governor to support the tenants, give them a voucher so they can pay their rent, so they won't be eventually evicted for not paying rent, and they'll feel a lot better, and they can use that money coming from the federal government to buy food, put it on the table for their kids, and the rent will be paid, and the worries will be much less at that time. One other thing, tell the politicians, don't think we're so gullible. If you don't allow us to evict a tenant for not paying rent, they're not going to pay the rent. And when they don't pay this month's rent, there is no way in 12 months they're going to be able to pay for 2 months or to start making payments. Sure. They spent the rent. I live for free. I'm going to live another month free. The money's gone. I didn't have any money at that time. I don't have any money now, and they're going to move on. So what you're doing with your no eviction laws is you're asking individual apartment owners to give free rent to a very large percent of the tenant population. We have here, first off, this morning, we're going to cover, before we get into the new laws that were passed, we're going to cover the new loan program, the SBA loan program. And we have a special speaker with us this morning to cover that for you. He's a senior vice president of commercial real estate lending with the Bank of California. He's had over 25 years of experience in commercial real estate banking, where he's built and supported high-performance teams. Most recently, he was executive director at J.P. Morgan and Chase, and over his 25-year career, 24 years with Chase, and several other companies, he focused on commercial real estate and multifamily lending. It's a real privilege and pleasure to introduce you today to Mr. John McLean. John, would you like to come up here?
Sure.
And tell us about how I can get a SBA loan. How can I get some money to make up for all this rent I'm going to lose as a result of tenants not paying?
Well, we have some good news. Again, John McLean with Bank of California. I'm happy to be here and to provide some updates on the apartment market as a whole, as well as the new SBA CARES Act. It's only about 3 weeks ago. You had super low treasury rates. All of the banks were competing to give you their lowest rates. Borrowers were shopping all over. Then the virus, lockdowns, the stock market turmoil, and now most banks have either stopped altogether or significantly tightened up their credit. We watched many banks bump up their rates by at least 1%, so definitely it's a tough environment. Although Bank of California has tightened up our credit standards and there's a lot more focus on liquidity, we are doing new loans, cash out refinances, purchase transactions, and we still have very competitive rates. We're actually really busy these days with a lot of the banks that are out of the market. So we're seeing a lot of activity, and we're busy with all of that. Talking about the SBA programs, the new SBA CARES Act was signed into law on March 27th. There's about $360 billion available, and it's allocated to 2 different programs. I wanted to let you know the differences in these programs and how you go about applying for them. The first program is the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. It's a mouthful. EIDL, Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. It's got about $10 billion. And the second program is the Paycheck Protection Program, commonly known as PPP. This one's got about $350 billion. I think it's actually $349 billion. I thought I would talk about the economic injury loans first, as this might be a good option for the smaller apartment owners to apply for. The EIDL is relatively easy to apply for, and these loans provide an immediate advance, a grant, for up to $10,000. The grant doesn't have to be paid back if it's used for payroll, sick leave, medical, or even mortgage payments. And the SBA can approve these loans based solely on the applicant's credit score. The economic injury loans are actually available for up to $2 million, but anything above $10,000 will need to be paid back, and there's going to be collateral required for loans in excess of $25,000, as well as personal guarantees for loans in excess of $200,000. The economic injury loans are to be applied for directly with the SBA. And I'll give you the website, and I'm thinking that we'll have this on the AOA website as well. The website to apply for the EIDL loan, it's covid19relief.sba.gov. Again, COVID, COVID 19relief.sba.gov. And when applying for this loan, the borrower should probably indicate that they're interested in the emergency grant, and that's, again, talking about that $10,000. It's also good to know that when businesses apply for these funds, they can apply to cover the operational costs as well. And whether or not it's the eventual loan, if you're applying for more than $10,000, whether or not that loan is approved, you probably are still going to get that grant of $10,000. So that's really the quick hit that I think a lot of the owners are looking for, at least if that $10,000 is going to make a difference. Now I'll talk about the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP. This is going to be popular for the large apartment owners that have more staff, and again, this will be for the W-2 employees. The PPP was established to guarantee businesses the loans they need to cover payroll for 8 weeks. They will also cover some utility and rent costs as well, but the primary purpose of that loan is for payroll. The PPP loans can be 100% forgiven if the business doesn't lay off employees or if they rehire employees that were recently laid off. These loans can also cover some rent, mortgage interest, and utilities, but at least 75% of the funds need to be used for payroll. Payroll would include health care, benefits, things like that too, even sick leave. There are rules that exclude salaries over $100,000. So if you have employees that are making over that, there's a cap of $100,000. It'll just be reduced to that cap. I'll also mention again that the PPP loans are for W-2 employees. So if you have 1099 employees, or if you're a single proprietor yourself, you need to apply for, those employees need to apply for their own funds as individual operators who have a sole proprietorship. The Paycheck Protection Program loans need to be applied for through your bank. I'll go one step further and say you should really be going to your current bank for this. As much as I'd love to help everyone out here at Bank of California, and we have our whole team there, the focus is going to be on our clients first, and I think a lot of the banks are flooded with these applications. So they're having to give a priority to their existing clients. So again, it's the same with us. Please be aware that the Paycheck Protection Programs are going to need some good payroll documentation. The maximum loan amount will be 2.5 times the average monthly payroll expense up to $10 million. So you're going to be having to provide either last year's payroll, or in some cases you can use this year's as well. And then the loan officer is going to go through and average out the numbers to figure out what it is. And then again, it's 2.5 times. I think the 2.5, the half part is to cover some rent and some other things that you may have there. Please also be aware that the Paycheck Protection loan forgiveness will be reduced if there's a reduction in the number of staff or a reduction of more than 25% of the wages paid to employees. There's a lot of uncertainty right now on the Paycheck Protection Program as it's a new program for the SBA. And the SBA and the banks are struggling to get it up and running. Even last night I was on a conference call with updates and changes to the documentation and process. And I know all of the banks are going through this too. This program is still evolving. Something to keep in mind is if anything is not forgiven on a PPP loan, if some of the funds were used for non-approved expenses or for above that cap of the 75%, it will have a low interest rate of 1%, and the payments would be deferred for 6 months but due in 2 years. So it's a short-term loan that's set up, and I'm sure the banks will be doing their best to make sure all of their clients are filling out the applications correctly, the bank's getting the right documentation, because we want you to qualify for everything and we don't want a 1% loan sitting out there at the end of the day on our end either. So we want to make sure everything you apply for is going to be approved and that all of this is going to be more grant money rather than a loan. In contrast, the EIDL program, and going back to the economic injury loans I mentioned at the beginning, this is an existing SBA program, and the $10,000 grants are probably the fastest way for businesses to obtain quick relief. Once approved, the funds should be received within 3 business days. Again, this is the SBA direct application, the one that I gave you online. The EIDL loan amounts above $10,000 will have a 3.75% interest rate and a maximum term of 30 years. So you do have the ability to get a larger loan amount on the economic injury loans. But it's just something to keep in mind that you can get the $10,000 pretty quick. That's an easier one. With both of these programs, the borrower needs to make a good faith certification that the business has been negatively affected by the coronavirus, the loan is necessary to support the operations, and the loan will be used to retain workers and maintain payroll. And again, you can include some of the rent and utility payments or mortgage interest as well. Just want to keep the percentages low on that. There's also a stipulation that the borrower is not applying for another loan for the same purpose and amounts. However, in this case, you can actually apply for both with the SBA. You can apply for both the EIDL loans as well as the PPP at the same time. I think there's a lot of folks that recommend you do that. So that's a high-level overview on the SBA CARES Act. You have the 2 programs to choose from, the EIDL and the PPP. The EIDL loans can get you a pretty quick $10,000 as a grant, and you apply directly with the SBA. And the PPP, Paycheck Protection Program, can get you a lot more payroll funds, but you need to go through the bank and provide your historical payroll documentation. I was just going to give a little bit of high-level feedback I've had from apartment owners. I've got a lot of large apartment owners, and in speaking with a few of them, they've actually been pleasantly surprised on their rent collections. I would say a few weeks ago, we had a lot of folks calling us, and the tenants were quoting all of the government moratoriums. So it sounded like a lot of tenants were not going to be paying. But we've seen a lot of the owners report back that the tenants understand that eventually they need to pay, or at least the property managers have been able to communicate that to the tenants. So, the collections have been a lot higher than they had expected, a lot higher than I expected too. I had a couple of comments we've been making from a couple of larger owners. We've been making good money for over 10 years, so helping out struggling tenants, waiving late charges, and even lowering rents is not bad, not too bad, and makes them feel pretty good. And then another went on to say he plans to write off the losses. So again, maybe it's not going to be too bad, and hopefully this is more of a short-term bump. And we do feel that this is more of a short-term, I think more the V-type economic impact, that it's a quick downturn. If you go back to 2009 and 10, that was a slowdown and kind of a slow up. The apartments came back pretty quick, but this is a very quick downward movement, with so many people out of a job. But we do think that once we get through these lockdowns, that it's probably going to come back pretty quick. Keep in mind too that there's not enough housing in California, as Dan was saying. So again, everything should bounce back pretty quick. The commercial market, on the other hand, is probably going to take a little bit longer to recover. To give you just a couple of things on the lending environment, although it's a lot tougher to get apartment loans, again, we're still doing them. There's a few banks that are still doing them. We're doing cash out refinances. And the way we're getting around the current tenant payment issues is to hold back some funds from the cash out proceeds. So a lot of times if we're doing a $500,000 cash out refinance, we're going to hold maybe 6 or 12 months payments. And that's how we were able to get our credit folks comfortable with making a brand new loan, giving cash out when we don't totally know what those rent collections are going to be. Our folks were comfortable with that, with the payment holdback. And actually it gives the borrower the ability to focus on their collections, on their property, and not have to worry about making their payments, for the 6 or 12 months. Although the SBA loans are either direct or through your existing bank, I'm happy to provide a quote, obviously, on a standard apartment loan or a purchase transaction. Once we're done working with our existing clients and getting their applications through for the PPP program, we will be able to assist other folks. So it's just a priority right now, is that I think pretty much all of the banks are going to be focusing on their existing clients, and that's why I recommend you go to your existing banker at this point. I think the AOA will have maybe my contact information, or you can always go to Bank of Cal if you have any questions on what we're doing. And we spell bank with a C, B-A-N-C, so I have to point that out. And that was about all I had. I don't know if you had any questions. I'll mention one thing, that again, the 1099 employees, the contract employees, the real estate brokers, all of those folks, they can apply for these SBA loans on Friday, April 10th. That's kind of the second wave. The first one was the businesses. The second one is for the 1099 employees. So it's, or not employees, but contract workers. So that's a different setup on those.
Most real estate brokers are independent contractors. Correct. What kind of a loan can they get as an individual? It's
the same. So they're able to apply for both, for the EIDL loans and the PPP loans. They would be applying for themselves. And again, when they're on that setup, like whether they're working for a big real estate firm, but if they're a 1099 employee, they're not a W-2, Friday, April 10th is the day that they're able to start applying. Not that you can't start filling out the forms, call your banker, talk with all of them now.
So every real estate salesman out there in the state of California, because we're talking about California, yep, could get $10,000 and have it forgiven right off the bat.
Correct.
And
yes.
So these people should be applying
they
for
should
that
be applying.
loan.
Really, everyone with a business. Now, keep in mind, there's $10 billion, and the grant's $10,000. So you can do the math. There's it's not infinite. I think there's a good chance, though, that we're going to have a round 2. Hopefully not a round 3. Hopefully we don't need it. All of this money is, again, it's our taxpayer money. So we're hoping that folks are doing it, for the right reasons and all. But yeah, you're right that these independent contractors can apply for both.
And did I hear you say that loan would go up to $2 million?
So the EIDL loans, again, it's an existing program. They didn't really have economic as one of the injury. It was more of a disaster loan. But these loans are available up to $2 million And it's, I think it was like the 375 rate with a 30-year term. So this is an existing program. The PPP, which is really what I think a lot of folks are focusing on right now, are the bigger businesses. That's a new program, and that's why everyone's kind of struggling with it, because we're trying to implement it, and the SBA is trying to implement it too. So questions come up, they come back with, you have a question, you ask the SBA, and then a little while later, the SBA comes out with another guidance because of some of those questions. So it's a little bit on the fly.
Does the apartment owner, if he's going for, he has no employees, he's a smaller owner, he manages his own building, to get that $10,000 forgiven, does it have to be spent a certain way?
Well, it's supposed to be, it's geared towards payroll. So yes, we definitely.
No, we're talking about not PP.
No, both of them. Both of them. There's payroll for themselves. It's also for business operation expense as well. So they are able to apply for the grant, the $10,000 grant. And again, they're showing, here was my income. Here's my income today. I'm not selling properties, or I'm not leasing properties. No,
we're talking about the apartment owner now.
Right.
Not we're talking about the owner.
Okay, I was just saying.
He has a
some of the
10-unit building, let's say.
Right.
And would he be able to get that $10,000?
Yes, he's going to show that here's the rental income I was receiving, and now I'm not receiving this. So that's what it's set up for. Is if your income is lower, you wouldn't do so much the paycheck protection one.
So
That's
you
not
could
gonna
go
work.
by your rents.
You would do your,
if you had a couple tenants that were not paying, then you could say that you
Correct.
could put those in.
Yes, you
Over
could
what
put that
period of time?
So these loans are kind of set.
Not the period of the loan. What period of time would
No, I
the
know.
loss
They're,
have to be
they're
there?
set up to monitor or to track, I think, the middle of February to about the end of June. Now, that could change depending on how long the lockdowns are out there. So there is a time frame on this that it is set up. However, depending on the economy and what happens, this could extend into a longer time period.
The utilities would go into this smaller loan also to go
Correct.
against that.
Correct.
So the utility bill for the smaller apartment owner could do it.
Correct.
I've got a question here that came in. How do you calculate the payroll costs?
So there's, okay, so if we're going to the PPP one, or you do need to provide your payroll. So anyone that's, and again, there's two swim lanes here. You have the disaster loan, the EIDL loan, and you have the PPP. If you're doing the PPP program for the payroll, you are going to have to provide your banker with, I think pretty much they want last year's payroll, and they're going to look at those numbers. If you don't, there's actually an ability that if you weren't in business a year before, the bankers can go back to a shorter time period. So they're going to look at January and February and try to annualize and average that.
So your tax return would probably show that?
Yes, but we're talking about yes, your tax return will show some of that, but really, if you're talking about the payroll, you're going to need to provide these payroll reports. It's going to show healthcare and some other things. Keep in mind, there's provisions where if somebody's getting more than $100,000 a year salary, if you've got staff in that case, you need to lower that amount. So the bankers are going to need to see your payroll to be able to do this. And it's not just for the bank. Again, it's for the borrower too. We don't want to set up something that all of a sudden turns out you've got more money than you should have, and now there's a loan and it's not all forgiven. So it's in both parties' best interest to make sure that we get that right in the beginning.
Now, the amount that on the payroll, if you paid the Social Security and you paid these other benefits, that counts?
That's included, yes.
That's going to count. So if you buy hospitalization on that payroll?
Health, yes. Health insurance is also in there.
So
Correct.
that's all included in it.
It's pretty amazing.
Okay, can you go over basically again on the rehiring of an employee that has been laid off, or if you reduce an employment during this period of time?
So there's a couple different provisions, and the different websites, or really the SBA gets into it a little bit more. But if the purpose of the loan is to cover payroll, if you have reduced staff already and you've had to let some folks go, you can bring them back on and pay them and show that as your payroll going forward. And you can apply for the loan to cover that. So that's really the purpose of the loan. I mean, both of these is really trying to keep people getting their paycheck, and really that's our tenants, paying us back on that. So yeah, it's set up for that, and then so you can rehire folks, as well as the other concern was if you were to furlough people and maybe the payroll starts to go down, if it's reduced by more than 25%, you're, I guess, in jeopardy of some of that loan not being forgiven. So you really want to be careful. Again, it goes back to on the PPP plan, protection plan, paycheck protection plan, you really want to work with your banker. And that's maybe in some ways why these loans are taking a little bit more time. There's a lot of detail that you need to go through and get it right. I think in some ways, I think even on our end, maybe we're looking at these and saying, let's bring the number down a little bit in case we're kind of missing something, so that we don't end up with portions of loans that are not being forgiven, and maybe that's something that's going to be a little more of an audit type thing. So there's different ways to look at that, but yeah, you definitely want to try to keep everything as consistent as it was in previous months, or from last year, if you're able to show that.
So an owner that has several buildings with a manager in each building, they may, on this PPI thing, might be able to go for $1 million, several millions of dollars.
Definitely, if their payroll is that high, they can. And again, we're talking about the forgiven part.
And that would all be forgiven.
Correct.
In other words, the government's going to write them a check for, say, $1 million, and if they have the employees, that kind of a payroll, then they write it off.
Correct.
And I think most of these people would be looking at that as a refund on all the taxes that they paid before, rather than looking at it as just a simple gift.
Correct.
It's
pretty amazing. I mean, I would encourage everyone, at least on the EIDL loans, that's something that, if you have a business, you're the sole proprietor, you've got a small apartment, shop, you own a few units or a few buildings, that's definitely one to look at. The payment or the paycheck protection program, it's a lot more detailed, but for all our large apartment owners, it's definitely something that they should be working with their banker. And again, you can apply for both.
Now, if they want this loan, they should go to where they've been doing business rather than come to you. That's what you're telling us.
Isn't that terrible to say that? As much as I want everyone to come to me, definitely give me a call or send an email for a standard apartment, purchase or refi, or commercial property too. But in this case, yeah, we're recommending you go to your banker. Pretty much all the banks are saying we've got to take care of our clients first. These numbers, although they're big, 350 and 10 billion, they're not that big. So these numbers are going to run out. It is behooving on people to move, quickly with these, and keep in mind that all your bankers are overwhelmed. So everyone's trying to do what's best. A lot of the banks will either have applications online, or you can be filling them out, and you're probably going to have to do a little bit more work yourself to help your bankers, so that they don't have to spend as much time going through it. If you're doing the payment protection program, or the paycheck protection program, definitely need to get your payroll there. You want to identify employees that are over 100,000. You should probably do some of the math there. Cap those salaries at 100, so that you can figure out the right numbers. So the banker is basically doing a check of what you've provided, and then they're able to submit it in.
Now, you were out of business yesterday for about 4 hours on SBA loans. They were shut down.
I don't think
No,
on our
they
end,
weren't shut down.
I didn't really know. The system's backed up, definitely. But I would say no, we're not out of business. We're reviewing paperwork. We're trying to get everything submitted.
So the most important advice might be get it in today.
Get in it, yes.
And if you don't get it in, were they going to run out of money or what?
They're probably going to run out of money. Those $10,000 grants, again, you can do the math on that. It's probably going to go pretty quick. I think there's a fair chance to assume there'll be a second round of this. And even on the payment or the paycheck protection program, there's a fair chance there'll be a second round of this too. And the second round, probably everyone will be a little more prepared and have a little quicker process. But it's worth your time to work on this. Give your banker a call. Your bankers should be trying to reach out too anyways. I know I've been reaching out to a lot of clients, although at the same time, very busy with the incoming calls and requests.
John, we want to thank you very much for being here today and telling us about the loans and what we can get. And goodness, it's free money.
It's free money.
They should
Yes.
apply for it. Don't let your pride get in the way. Apply for it no matter what, whether you need it or not.
As soon as possible, yes.
They're going to give it away. And again, it's kind of a refund on all the taxes that us older guys have paid over our lifetime.
Over all these years, yes.
Okay, thank you very much for being
All right,
here today.
thank you. I won't shake hands, right?
Appreciate it. We will not shake hands. We got a speaker coming up. Folks, get your handkerchiefs out, okay? Because our next speaker is going to tell you about a new law that was passed, not law, regulations that were passed last night in regard to apartment owners. And I personally can't believe the property rights that we've lost as citizens of this great United States. And there's going to be a lot of lawsuits that are going to follow later on because of the rights, the property rights that have been taken away from us, the income. They've taken our property without paying for it, basically, and they've given it away. And they've purchased votes with it. The politicians have, and that's exactly what they're doing. There's one politician, in fact, up in Sacramento, who wants to lower all rents by 25%. That's just one of the things that they're trying to do. The tenant unions, here's an announcement here. The tenant unions are forming. They want to go against this also. They want your property, folks. That's what they're after. And they've taken a good part of it already through the rent control and these other eviction laws. It's a real privilege to introduce our next speaker. He's going to tell you about what's going on in the industry. And most of you are familiar with our speaker. He's with one of the top eviction firms in the country. I think maybe this regulation may have put a little bit of that out of business. There, as far as evictions, it's a real privilege to introduce to you Mr. Dennis Block. Dennis, it's all yours.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar, and thanks, of course, to Dan Fowler and the wonderful Apartment Owners Association, who is really the premier association for representing income property owners. I, too, have been involved with income property owners now for the last 43 years. And this is probably the saddest moment that I have experienced in our field. Property owners right now are under a black plague based on something that just occurred yesterday afternoon by the California Judicial Council. I actually worked, ladies and gentlemen, all weekend on a wonderful seminar, did a wonderful PowerPoint presentation, and had it all ready to go, had all kinds of suggestions for my clients and landlords alike with regard to things they needed to do in these pandemic times that we're facing. And then as I drove home last night from the office, I got word that that speech was basically thrown out the window. And this morning I wrote this one. You'll see me reading my notes a little more closely than I normally do. But the California Judicial Council issued emergency rules yesterday afternoon. So the first question would be, what is the California Judicial Council? It's not the legislatures. It's not our governor or our mayor. So who is it? Well, did a definition. The California Judicial Council is under the leadership of the California Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, and in accordance with the California Constitution, the council is responsible for ensuring the consistent, independent, impartial administration of justice. That's what the California Council is. I question their authority to issue laws, but laws they did do. And what did they do? What they did was they banned all evictions for the most part. It supersedes any eviction laws that are on the books. And under this new law that was just promulgated last night, it states that a court may not issue a summons on a complaint for unlawful detainer unless, in the court's discretion, it is necessary to protect public health and safety. So what does that mean? It means if you have a tenant who's not paying you the rent, and it has nothing to do with the pandemic, the person hasn't lost his job, and maybe he has $300,000 in a bank account, and you ask him for the rent. Under this law, the tenant doesn't have to pay you the rent, and the landlord has no ability to bring forth an eviction action. No ability. Now, you're going to have some tenants that are moral and know what they need to do, and that is that, hey, I owe the rent, I'm going to pay the rent. You're going to have a lot of other tenants who are going to say, you know what, there's nothing involving me where I can get involved in an eviction lawsuit where I can be evicted, so why should I pay? It's kind of tantamount to driving on the freeway and you see a sign that says speed limit 65. And then underneath the sign in bold letters it says, but we're not going to enforce it. So where is the incentive on tenants to pay their rent when they know they cannot be evicted? You cannot bring forth an eviction action. Now, prior to yesterday, the laws were in most jurisdictions, and there were 80 jurisdictions up and down the state of California, which stated that if it's for non-payment of rent and it's causally connected to the COVID-19 virus, then your rent is deferred. You don't have to pay it now. It will become owing once the pandemic is declared over, and then you'll have, in most jurisdictions, it was 6 months to pay. In the city of Los Angeles, they gave you 1 year to pay. And that's the way it was. So you could bring forth an eviction, for example, if a person didn't lose his job, had money in the bank, or let's pretend it had nothing to do with rent. Let's pretend it had to do with extra people occupying the premises in violation of the rental agreement, or the person was damaging the premises. You could bring all these eviction cases at that point. But now, under this judicial council edict, you cannot bring any eviction case unless it involves public safety. So maybe if the guy is creating a nuisance, other than that, or damaging your place, other than that, there's really nothing a landlord can do except to wait for his money. And that's it. Now, really, what is the incentive? You're going to have, I did an informal survey from my clients before the Judicial Council passed this law. And on this informal survey, I asked how many landlords are experiencing that their tenants are paying their rent in full. Now, of course, this is very informal and only dealt with my clients who went online and took the survey. And only 30% of their tenants paid in full. Well, some of them paid 25%, some of them paid 50%. About 20% didn't pay anything at all based on this survey. Now, if you're in a situation now where you realize that if you don't pay, there's no one who's going to file an eviction action. There's no one who's going to be able to taint your record, your credit record, on the basis that no eviction action can be brought, then where is the incentive? And even if you are that moral tenant who says, you know what, I owe the rent, I have the money, even if you are that moral tenant, but you know that 6 people in the building are not paying their rent, and you know these people go to work, you know they didn't lose their jobs, okay, and that they certainly had the ability. How many months is it going to take you to feel like, hey, you know what, am I really being smart here? Am I really sitting there and doing the right thing when no one else is paying the rent? Why shouldn't I jump in on this train? And what you're going to find based on this law is that owners are going to lose their buildings. Owners need to pay their mortgages. Owners need to put food on the plates for their families. But there's going to be no income coming in. And I predict this will be a housing crisis. Talking about, as Dan said, that a housing crisis, that nobody will be building apartments. Why would you? Why would you do anything in this state with these kinds of crazy laws? So what we're seeing is, again, it's just an attack on income property owners. We're supposed to solve the pandemic issue for the entire world. It's all on the shoulders of landlords. There's really no loans that are going to help landlords. Landlords don't have payroll per se. They either hire a management company themselves or they do their own management. But there's no, quote, real payroll. Most landlords, the far majority, people think there's all these big corporations that all own these thousands of units. As we all know, landlords generally have 4 to 10 units. And many of these landlords live in their own buildings, okay? And their rents are just as important as being able to get a salary if you were working on a job. And yet, they're taking away all the incentive for a tenant to pay the rent, even if he's financially able to pay the rent. Let's move on. I can't file an eviction unless it's based on public safety. What about those cases where I've already filed the lawsuit, which I have. I've got plenty of lawsuits, hundreds of lawsuits that had nothing to do with the pandemic, that these lawsuits that were filed for rent for January, rent for February. What did that have to do with the pandemic? It had nothing to do. Am I allowed to continue on with those lawsuits? And the answer is no. If the tenant doesn't answer the lawsuit, so therefore, it goes by way of default. I should be able to just get a judgment. I cannot file a default on any case at this point in time. It will not be accepted by the court. Hey, I served the tenant. It dealt with rent owed in January. The tenant didn't respond to the case. I'm allowed to take his default, get a judgment, and then execute on that judgment. The Judicial Council has refrained all California landlords from taking a default unless it's dealing with public safety, which means you'd have to go in there and somehow prove that this tenant was creating a nuisance in the building. But barring that, I cannot take a default. I cannot finish any case started based on this Judicial Council edict that they just did yesterday. Let's move on. If I had a case where I had filed it with the court and the tenant answered the lawsuit, in that case, I'd be entitled to obtain a trial date, have the case heard by a judge, and prevail on that basis. In this situation, if you have a case where the tenant has answered the lawsuit, so I'm requesting a trial, I cannot have a trial date now that comes up earlier than 60 days. Quite frankly, it's going to take longer than that, but the court is refrained from setting a trial date that is earlier than 60 days. If you have a trial date that's already been set, and the proceeding was as of April 6th, that was yesterday, it must be continued for an additional 60 days. So let's say I had a trial date that was set to go on May 1st. And of course, this has been a long time to get to that point. Based on the Judicial Council's ruling yesterday, it's an additional 60 days. An additional 60 days. Now, this pandemic will not last forever. I am predicting that probably by May, beginning of May, certainly by the end of May. California is obviously leading the nation in being sensible with regard to the pandemic and following the rules as by our health professionals. But I am predicting that it will be over. And when it is over, the issue is, will things return to normal? Well, they'll certainly return to normal for most people, but where will that put the landlord? Well, one would think that once the pandemic is over, once the moratorium is ended by Governor Newsom, that of course these rules, as published by the Judicial Council, will end as well. But that's not the case. That is not the case at all. They state that these rules will remain in effect until 90 days after the governor declares that the state of emergency relating to the COVID-19 pandemic is lifted. 90 days. So that means your tenant returns to work or never even left work. And let's pretend that the governor, as of May 31st, declares that the pandemic is over and life can go back to as it was. Your tenant has no reason to pay the rent for June, no reason to pay the rent for July, and no reason to pay the rent for August, because even though he hasn't paid rent for months, they're giving tenants an additional 90 days after the pandemic has been declared over, before a landlord can finally say, I'm going to take you to court, and first go through the court system. And let's turn our attentions there. The court systems always have been a little overcrowded, always takes its time to go through the legal system. Even in an unlawful detainer action, court actions are given priority, but still, you've got so many people attempting to use the court system. This is prior to the pandemic. Now what we're going to do is we're going to close all the courts to all legal actions for an additional 90 days. Can you imagine the backload of cases that will exist once we're finally able to file a case, presumably on September 1st? How many cases are going to get filed then? It's going to go on for forever. So you can look at another 6 months before you'll finally get your case to court, even with priority, in my opinion. How many owners are going to be able to hold on for this period of time? How many? Are they going to sit there for another 6 months because the tenant knows? Tenants, once they get involved in an unlawful detainer action, they don't pay the rent. They wait for the case to be over, right? And they wait to be evicted. How many of those tenants, how many landlords are going to be able to survive that additional period of time? Yet they made this law for 90 days after the pandemic is declared over. It's insanity. Many landlords will lose their buildings because of this law. And again, what they're doing is they're financing the horrific issues dealing with this plague, and that's what it is, but they're financing it on the backs of landlords. And that's exactly what they're doing. And this is what we're going to have to be involved in. 90 days after the pandemic is considered closed. So what can you do? And the answer is, I don't really know what you can do. I know we have a lot of people calling our office, and if you do have questions at our office, I have a toll-free number, 1-800-77-EVICT. My suggestion would be to start a dialogue with your tenants. And that is probably the best thing that you can do, to counsel your tenants and tell them the following, that this is not going to be rent forgiveness during this time period. This is at best rent deferments. You should enter into a rent deferment contract with the tenant, but in this dialogue. Okay, I know you've lost your job. Let's make it so that you'll pay half the rent for this period of time and the other half the rent at a different period of time, or monthly rent payments to make it easier for the tenants. But you need to have this dialogue with the tenant. But the tenant has to understand that this is not a free rent period. That the that the rent will become owed, that there will be a reckoning day. And that's the discussion that you need to have with your tenants. There's other things that you can do to put pressure on tenants, specifically those tenants that really can pay the rent and are just trying to use this as a way of getting out of their lawful obligations. Nothing prevents landlords from filing small claims court lawsuits for the rent right now. And our firm can assist you with that. Once again, 1-800-77-EVICT. We can assist in filing small claims court. That does not evict the tenant, but it does get a judgment against the tenant. For landlords with higher rents, we can actually file civil lawsuits for non-payment of rent, which we're discussing with our clients at this point in time. But again, you're going to have to sit there and at foremost try to talk to your tenants, counsel them, tell them that the rent will, of course, be owed. There is no rent forgiveness, and try to have a rent deferment agreement with them or an understanding that they will pay you. But again, for our governmental officials who create this, they're creating havoc for all income property owners in the state of California, where I don't see people who have mortgages, have debt to support, that they're not going to be able to support that debt. So I wish everybody good luck. If you have questions, feel free to call us. But really, we're in a situation now where our government is failing us. Our government is taking away our rule of law. Our country is based on rules of law, and our country is taking away the rule of law. You cannot have a situation where you're telling people, well, here's the rule, but there's no enforcement. That's what happened yesterday by our Judicial Council. Thank you.
Dennis, we had some questions that have come in. One of them that just came in over the email, the sheriff stopped doing eviction services 3 days before lockout. Why was this not grandfathered in?
Well, the sheriff, prior to even this Judicial Council ruling, which was just yesterday, had their own rules and just stopped doing evictions. They wanted to wait for the pandemic to be over. So, for example, we have so many cases where we obtain judgments. We got something called a writ of possession. It's at the sheriff's office. The sheriff's office had even served a 5-day notice to vacate, but they have now halted all evictions. We're waiting for them to start up again. I'm not sure when they will. I'm hoping that they will start up in May. All those evictions that are in the pike where I already have judgments. Some of these judgments are where the tenants went to court and we entered into a stipulated agreement. In one case, we have it where the tenant was given $10,000 to move on a certain date. That date was April 1st. Well, he's got his money. He's still not moving. And even though we have the paperwork at the sheriff's office to enforce it, they're not doing that. I have another example, which wasn't as relevant as of yesterday, where a tenant rented a house in Beverly Hills. The monthly rent, $27,500. $27,500.
Was that one of your kids?
No, they don't pay that much money, a few pennies less. But they signed a 2-year contract commencing March 1st. On April 1st, the tenant tells the landlord that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, he's not paying the rent. So you just see just the total bastardization of people using this as an excuse where it doesn't rely. But again, we're hoping, going back to your question, Dan, we're hoping that the sheriff will institute, start to institute these evictions, certainly once the pandemic is declared over.
The case of the tenant being given the $10,000, how do you normally advise that $10,000 transfer and when?
Well, in this particular case, the way the settlement went down was that he needed this money to move, so it was given at the initiation of the settlement agreement, the stipulation for judgment. He then had another 30 days to vacate the premises, and that was supposed to be as of March 31st, April 1st. He hasn't moved, and the sheriff won't do the eviction, and he's got, of course, the landlord's money.
Is there some way where that could have been avoided, possibly? The money being paid only after he handed over the keys and was moved out?
In this particular case, there were many issues involved that made the case a little bit more difficult to actually win. So it was a reasonable settlement that as long as they're signing a stipulated judgment, there's nothing on this God's earth that would have stopped the sheriff, in my mind, when this deal was entered into. I don't think anybody could have planned what this plague which has hit the world and thought about the consequences of that. I mean, I've been involved with cases now for 43 years. I probably have done over 200,000 eviction cases. If I've entered into a stipulation for judgment where money was given beforehand, quite frankly, we're going to enforce that, and there's nothing that could come in the way until now.
Okay, question. How do, I don't know how this is related, but it came in. How do we handle repair requests?
Well, nothing stops anything else. So notwithstanding the fact that a tenant is not paying the rent legitimately because, hey, he works as a waiter in a restaurant and he doesn't have a job now. I mean, we all have compassion. Or he has money and he just doesn't want to pay. The law specifically states that the landlord has to make the repairs, even with no income coming in. It's actually a great question, Dan, because what are landlords supposed to do? How are they going to take care of an expensive repair when there's no income coming in? Can he be cited by building and safety? Of course he can, because there's no forgiveness. It's only everything is going to be on the backs of landlords.
What about showing vacancies at this time? What if the tenant doesn't want to let you in because he's afraid he'll get the virus?
That's true. And I don't think, I think Mayor Garcetti in the Los Angeles area here prevents, as part of their rules, say you can't show units anymore if it's occupied. Just like you can't show houses anymore. I believe that's what the law is due to the pandemic. So again, you can't go in there and inspect a tenant's unit unless it's an emergency. So that's out the window now based on this. But I mean, these are legitimate things, and I could see where, hey, I'm trying to stay safe. I'm a tenant. I'm in my unit, and I don't want strangers coming in. I get that, and based on the discretion of the tenant, I think that's a reasonable rule. However, I don't think it's reasonable to say that if a tenant who legitimately can pay rent doesn't pay rent, that I have no way of enforcing the law. Nothing.
Two roommates, common question. One has lost the job, can't pay. Is the other responsible for the full rent?
Well, it's a partnership that rented the unit, just like a husband and wife or two individuals. It's a partnership, and the partnership is responsible. So both tenants, of course, are responsible for the full amount of rent. This judicial council finding or edict is insidious because it doesn't say that the tenant doesn't owe the money. It doesn't do away with contract rights. It leaves everything else intact except for one small thing. You can't enforce it. So what's the point of a law that you can't enforce? This takes away the fabric of our society.
How about, I rented the apartment from you. You don't allow animals, except, of course, legal. You don't allow animals, and I've moved in animals. I've moved in another roommate. What can I do?
You can do absolutely nothing. Nothing. Prior to yesterday, I would tell you, you could bring forth that eviction. You could serve a 3-day notice to perform or quit. It has nothing to do with the pandemic. And that was the way I wasn't a big fan of that law, but at least it made logical sense that, hey, if it doesn't have anything to do with the pandemic, at the very minimum, allow me to enforce my rights. Well, you could have up until April 6, 2020, but right now I can't enforce my rights. The guy can bring in 14 dogs. The guy can bring in extra people. The guy can make alterations to your premises. There's no way to enforce it based on this judicial council finding.
What if I had a party every night till 4 o'clock in the morning and I'm bothering all the other tenants? Is there any way possible to get me out?
Well, the one thing that they did state is that you can bring forth an unlawful detainer if it's based on health and safety. So in other words, you are allowed to bring forth a nuisance eviction. You have to first get permission. You'd have to file some sort of a lawsuit and go in on some sort of what they call an emergency ex parte motion. And then finally, with a finding of the court that yes, this is a nuisance situation, I'm going to direct the court clerk to issue a summons. So with that summons, then I can then proceed forward with the eviction. But barring that, all bets are off.
Can your firm get me into court if I want to evict somebody like that?
If it's based on a nuisance, yes. There's also another one that you can do, which would be based on something called a forcible detainer, which is where you have a vacant home and someone just breaks into the home and won't get out. That's called a forcible detainer. This judicial council rule does not apply to forcible detainers.
Here's a question that came in. What are the terms of the rent deferment agreement, since you now have another legally binding document that may not be enforced?
Well, again, on the deferment agreement, I think it's just something that will encourage tenants to pay the rent, give them a break so that they just don't sit there and say, hey, I'm not going to pay anything. But again, if they don't follow the terms of your deferred rent agreement, your contract, then what can you do? Can you bring forth an unlawful detainer? Of course not. So you'd have to wait for this to be over and then wait incredulously another 90 days after the governor declares that the pandemic order is over. So this is really a nightmare situation. I'm sitting here and I'm just cannot believe the ripples effects that this is going to have for our industry.
This is kind of another question that was answered, I believe. The lease ends on May 15th. Can I evict?
Well, even under the previous rules, you could, because you're not terminating a tenancy. The tenancy is terminating by its own terms. Now, this is assuming you're not in a rent-controlled area. So let's pretend it was a single-family home and the lease ended on May 15th, and you were planning on moving back to your own home, or you were planning on selling your home and you needed the tenant out. Prior to yesterday, you would be able to bring forth an unlawful detainer. But right now, you can't, because you cannot bring forth any unlawful detainer. The court clerk will not issue a summons. If I don't have a summons, I can't serve the lawsuit. And therefore, that tenant can sit there.
You're an apartment owner. They want to know if they should rent out any vacancies right now, or should they just leave them vacant?
It's a really good question, and I've had different opinions. What I'm recommending at the very minimum is that you get your first month's rent and 2 months security. On that basis, at least you've covered 3 months worth of your rent, because just as that person in Beverly Hills who is paying $27,500 per month and then didn't pay after the first month, at least you'd have some leeway. Now, under California law, you are allowed, and this would be if you can find a tenant who can do this, and based on no one earning money, I don't know if you can, but you are allowed to take 6 months to 1 year rent in advance. That is permissible. So you could sign a 1 year lease with a tenant and say, I want 6 months up front plus a 2 month security. So if you can find a tenant with that wherewithal, certainly you'd be very safe in doing so. But really, what's the difference? So should you not rent out the unit because the guy in the second month can say, I'm not going to pay the rent, and therefore I don't want to take the chance? My recommendation would be get as big a security as you can, because one thing is certain: if your unit is vacant, you're not making any money. So at the very minimum, I would say try to get yourself obviously a very well-qualified tenant who's not in an industry that you would feel that would be affected by the pandemic, and try to get at least 2 months security. I think that's the best you can do.
The other one I can answer very quickly. How do I determine the new tenant will pay? You gave a very good answer. Get a lot of money up front, as much money up front as possible. Call the AOA and get the credit reports, get your eviction reports. And one thing that we're stressing more than ever, call the former landlord. Call the guy where he rented before. Call the guy who rented before that. And be very careful who you're talking to, because they could give you a friend's name and a friend's phone number. Dennis, how would you get around that? They give the friend's name and the friend says, oh yeah, I rented to him and he pays the rent on time. All the time.
Yeah, it's very difficult because we see those types of fraud issues coming up all the time. But generally, the best thing is the AOA credit report. Generally, a person who's going to go to that level is not going to have good credit. And as the Apartment Owners Association has letters A, B, C, and that really kind of determines whether this is going to be a person with the wherewithal to continue to pay rent.
You're talking about, we give a rating to each one that you come in with, and that rating, the A, B, C, D, or F rating that you get, and it tells you the likelihood and your building. If you have a building down in the slums, you may want to take somebody with a C rating. You have a A-rated apartment, then you're going to want A-rated tenants to go into that. Does the new law apply to landlords for commercial real estate?
I'm so glad that you asked that question, because I meant to discuss that. And incredulously, this applies to residential and commercial. Everything I said applies to both. So if you have a store where you see you're a landlord and you've rented to let's say a takeout place, and you see the lines going out, or maybe you rented to a market. We know the markets are making a lot of money because everything is flying off the shelves. They can't keep it in their place. If your tenant, the market, doesn't want to pay you the rent, and he's going to claim that it's the pandemic, that is the reason, even though you can take pictures of people in lines trying to get into the store, you are barred from filing an unlawful detainer action.
So the business can stay.
The business can stay. So both residential and commercial established tenants, you cannot proceed forward with an eviction based on what occurred on April 6th by our judicial council.
This sounds like a tenant sent this question in. The tenant was mailed a letter regarding his options for unpaid rent. Email. He was sent an email. Use email. He was emailed regarding the option for unpaid rent. Is that a legal way to communicate? And if tenant doesn't respond, what happens?
Well, that certainly is a legal way to communicate. The city of Los Angeles, for example, is requiring all landlords to serve a specific notice dealing with the pandemic on each tenant, be it residential or commercial. Again, the tenants, if they're creating a situation where they want to have a dialogue with you, I'm encouraging landlords, have that dialogue with the tenants to really prevent just no rent coming in and really no way to enforce it.
The landlord, let's see, for the landlord's requirement to provide tenants notice of their newly afforded protections that they have, the letter that tells them how they're protected. With that, the penalties for that, are they expected to check the city's website every day because the laws are changing so fast? What do I do?
Well, they say that penalties can be imposed if landlords in the city of Los Angeles, for just their Los Angeles tenants, residential, commercial, must serve this notice on each and every tenant, and failure to do so can result in penalties. They don't define what that is.
So that word may kind of throws it off?
Yeah.
They may do it or not. If so, they're suggesting the tenant can refuse to agree to a payment, withhold the April and possibly May rent for 12 months, pay all the other months, rent on time, and then on the last day of the 12th month, pay the landlord the back due rent for April and May.
That is what the law is written to state. But the truth of the matter is, and anybody who's owned income properties, especially residential tenants and even commercial tenants, how many people really think that these tenants who missed those 2 payments in 1 year are going to come back and pay the rent. Now, 1 year is for the city of Los Angeles. Most other jurisdictions like San Francisco and Oakland and San Diego are saying 6 months. How many people really think they're going to do that? And if you have a tenant in your unit, really what you're going to say is, okay, just pay me the rent, right? I think most landlords will do that. Just pay me the rent and I'll forget those 2 months. So basically, when they talk about that there's no rent forgiveness, that it's just a deferment of the rent, the truth of the matter is the landlord's going to take a hit. And this hit is going to be for at least a couple of months' rent for their entire building, and potentially much longer.
We do have some honest people, however, who are going to pay their rent every month.
I'm not disagreeing with that, but I do believe that when you see 5 different units in the building that aren't paying the rent when they legitimately could, and you're the 6th unit, how many months is it going to take you to finally say, you know what, I don't want to pay the rent? You're going to see some of that. There's only so much, that's going to give in that type of a situation.
Does the ordinance really prevent the landlord from collecting back due rent upon the tenant vacating and then require the landlord to wait for the remainder 12 months?
That is correct. So what's going to happen is a tenant who didn't pay the rents, and again, 12 months is only for Los Angeles. Every other jurisdiction has been 6 months. You can see how Los Angeles favors tenants more than everybody else. But so let's pretend you have a tenant. He didn't pay the April's rent, May's rent, and he moves out of June. Well, if the pandemic is declared over as of June 1st and the tenant moves away, you'd have to wait 1 year, June 1st, 2021, to then first ask that tenant for the money. Where is that tenant? Do you know where he is? Are you going to bring forth a small claims court lawsuit? What you've just done is create a debt that will never be repaid.
Dennis, the questions just keep coming in. When does the 12-month countdown to payback begin?
That happens once Governor Newsom declares that the pandemic is over.
No requirement to show hardship?
Hardship has nothing to do with the equation.
Why is there no lawsuits started on the property rights right away?
Well, this happened yesterday. I predict that there probably will be. Again, I question, and I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but I question the Judicial Council creating this type of a law that states that you cannot enforce laws that are on the books. I just don't understand how they say that you cannot file an unlawful detainer at this point.
And what if the tenant gave bad information on his application, a fraudulent reference? Any recourse on that right away?
It's funny, I'm doing a lawsuit right now where, and I just took this case in, where allegedly 3 people rented a unit, 2 of them that had weak credit, 1 of them that had strong credit. It turned out that the one with the strong credit never filled out the application, never signed the rental agreement, and never intended to rent this. One of the other 2 tenants actually signed this person's name and created phony rent pay stubs, or excuse me, not rent pay stubs, but work pay stubs. And we just found this out. The landlord called this person who lives in Florida, and she said, I never rented this place. I don't know anything about this. And he said, but is this your information? She said, yes, that's in my information, but I never rented, I never signed anything. And those pay stubs, those are fraudulent. Those aren't my pay stubs. So we're bringing forth an eviction. This is called a non-curable breach of a rental agreement, where you lie on your application. So we started by serving the 2 tenants who remained a 3-day notice to quit based on a non-curable breach. There's no way for him to cure it. He's lied on his application, and that's considered a non-curable breach of the tenancy. That notice has been served, and that notice will expire. It probably is expiring on Thursday. And on Friday, my firm intended to bring forth an eviction action. But based on the Judicial Council's order of yesterday, my hands are tied. I can't file that lawsuit now. Those people can sit there even though the whole tenancy is based on fraud. These are the consequences of the strong arm of the law that tries to put all the onerous on the one segment of society without any thought process at all, without any discussion by anybody. This came as a total surprise. The governor entered an emergency order, okay? The California state legislature created an order, okay? It was voted on by the legislature, and under the protection clauses and emergency clauses of the owners by our Constitution, they could do this. Where did the Judicial Council on one day get up and say, you can't file an eviction, even with the mayor's orders that afforded protection based on the pandemic, even on the state legislature's ordinance, which provided protection for tenants under the pandemic? Where did they come off and just do a blanket order? This is insanity, ladies and gentlemen.
Should I enter into a promissory agreement, signing the rent? They owe $2,000. Should I push this promissory note agreement onto the tenant?
I would not do a promissory note agreement. First of all, if you have a contract, either written or oral, that is already a promissory note. It is already a contract to pay. So why would you want a promissory note to pay? And to get kind of technical, if you enter into a promissory note, then you've transmuted the debt from rent to a contract debt. And if it's a contract debt, then I can't file an unlawful detainer once the floodgates open. So you don't want to transmute. You want that debt to be rent, because if it's rent, I can bring forth a quick unlawful detainer, which the end result is not only to get a judgment for rent, but more importantly, a judgment for possession, so that I can have the sheriff enforce that and escort these people off the property. But if I transmute the debt to a promissory note, it's not part of an unlawful detainer.
Should I immediately serve tenants that have not paid their full rent with a 3-day notice? What's to be gained? Am I waiving any rights if I don't serve them with a 3-day notice?
I had this discussion today with my associates at the office at about 8 o'clock as I was trying to write this seminar for you guys. And they said, so if somebody wants, they came up to me, if somebody wants a 3-day notice, should we serve it? And my response was, what's the point? What's the point in serving a 3-day notice if I can't file an eviction in 3 days? So my answer is, I don't see any reason to serve a 3-day notice.
Just let them stay there and tear the place up.
That's about the size of it. California landlords really think about what's going on in this state and what our government has done to us.
Then some owners are taking the rent and they're lowering it by a certain amount so the tenants will stay in there. Once they lower the rent under rent control, like even up in Berkeley and Oakland and San Francisco, where in West Hollywood and Santa Monica, where the laws are so strict, once they lower that rent, are they going to be able to raise it back up under the rent control laws?
Under the rent control laws, they will be able to. When you move into a unit, that's considered the base rent amount. So if that unit was going for $2,500 and that's what you paid, now fast forward, let's say 6 months, and because of this pandemic, I'm going to reduce your rent by half, let's pretend, $1,250. It makes no difference, because once the pandemic is over, you have the right to raise the rent back always to the base level, the rent that you originally charged for that unit.
So it's okay to lower the rent, but I should be careful to raise it back up
Immediately.
immediately when they
Yes.
lift the pandemic, or
Yes.
when that 90 days is up.
Now you see, instead of investing in apartments, we should have done it in hand sanitizers. Think about it, how the money we could have made. But no, we decided we'd do it in apartments.
Should I offer a one-time permanent rent discount to tenants as an incentive to have them pay their rent immediately? Should I put this in a written lease agreement if I do it?
Well, everything should be in writing if you do it as a contract, I would think. But again, this is a case-by-case situation. There is no panacea as to what landlords should do. Again, I think you should have a dialogue with each of your tenants who aren't paying you the rent. No reason to talk to the nice people that are. But as to the persons that aren't, I would have a dialogue with each and every tenant individually to see what can be arranged in terms of getting your rent payments.
Boy, this is a tough guy here. What are the penalties for locking a tenant out without a court order or turning off the utilities?
In each of those cases, what's going to happen is that they'll call the local police department, the tenant will, and the police department will force the landlord to open up the door. And of course, the tenant at that point could sue the landlord for wrongful eviction. You'd be involved in a lawsuit. There's no percentages in that. There's laws on the books that state that if you turn off utilities, somewhat of an indirect method of trying to evict the tenant, that you can be liable for penalties up to $250 per day. No, landlords have to stay within the law, notwithstanding the fact that our politicians are going outside the law to harm our industry.
No lockout, no turning off utilities, no harassing to get them out of the building.
That's right. Nothing except just sit there and wait for your rent, and that's exactly what you're going to have to do, wait for your rent.
What if an Airbnb decides to use the pandemic not to pay rent?
Oh, tell me about that. I already have a case where a guy has rented out a house. These people moved in, refused to move out, and this was way before the pandemic started, and they've used every delay tactic they can to remain in possession of the premises and basically destroyed this remodeled house. So again, if you can't use the eviction process, you have no other remedy. You can sue them on a breach of contract, and that might have some effect. But again, if these people don't care about their credit and they don't have anything, it's basically useless to do anything. So all you're going to do is sit there and allow someone to stay in your home.
I think you already answered this one. Should we still serve 3-day notices to tenants who haven't paid the rent? You basically said that won't do any good to do it.
I don't see any point in doing that.
Now, some areas restrict even sending the 3-day notice. I don't know what area that is.
I think that is Culver City that says that you can be fined $1,000 if you serve a 3-day notice when the person truly has a legitimate reason for not paying the rent, that he lost his job, that he has the virus, or he's caring for a member of the family that has the virus, or his work hours were cut so he doesn't have full pay, and that you can be fined even for doing that. Insanity laws.
Can we send tenants to collections?
You certainly can, and I think that, and we're trying to formulate a plan at our office now where landlords maybe should be filing small claims court lawsuits. Nothing prevents you from doing that and getting a judgment, and it might have some inhibiting factor on the tenant to do what's right, assuming the tenant can do what's right. Again, it's a case-by-case situation. Truly, if you have a waiter and he's not working, there's really no point in doing that. But for those tenants that are working and just kind of gaming the system, in that situation, I can see bringing forth a regular civil lawsuit. There's also something called an action for ejectment. The Judicial Council didn't think of that one. We can bring an action for ejectment. It's very similar to an eviction action, except that it doesn't afford us priority under the law. So it's basically a regular civil lawsuit where we would file a lawsuit for rent owed and also for ejectment, that literally we could have a sheriff enforce that. But again, since it doesn't have any priority under the law, these kinds of cases would take over a year to complete.
Can I issue an increase in security deposit notice, and if so, when?
Well, if you're under rent control, you really can't do that. If you weren't under rent control, you certainly could ask for a security deposit increase. Serve that change of terms of tenancy saying that I want more security deposit up to 2 months rent for a residential premise. But what happens if he doesn't pay? The normal thing, you'd serve a 3-day notice to perform or quit, giving him 3 days to pay that security, and then you can't file an eviction.
So I could ask the guy to do me a favor and give me more security deposit.
Yes, you could ask the tenant in this pandemic times to give you a larger security deposit.
Can the landlords file a class action lawsuit against this judicial ruling?
You can't file class action lawsuits against governmental bodies, but you can declare that this was an unconstitutional act that the Judicial Council initiated yesterday. Again, I'm not a constitutional attorney. My guess is anytime you're going to say that this was for the public safety, that these laws were created, that there's a wide range of power under the California Constitution and under any constitution for governmental agencies to create these laws. So it's going to certainly be an uphill battle. And when is this battle going to be over? Are you going to get an emergency restraining order against the Judicial Council? Probably not. And if it does proceed to trial, when would it proceed to trial? Way after this is all over and landlords have already lost their buildings.
This is a hard one to understand. This person is in Los Angeles. The moratorium states 12 months to pay back after the ordinance is lifted. What are the options? Really have no options, do we?
No. I mean, you can try to enter into an agreement with the tenant on a payment plan. If they do enter into an agreement, then that agreement controls over the 12 months. But again, if they don't want to enter into an agreement, they don't have to. And they don't have to show you, even under the old law, they didn't have to show you that I lost my job. You could ask for proof, but they didn't have to show it to you. If they didn't choose to not to show it to you, they could still use it as a defense in an unlawful detainer proceeding. But we've gone beyond that now, because as of yesterday, you can't bring forth an unlawful detainer proceeding.
What about landlords that pay all the utilities, but the tenants stop paying rent?
Again, they don't care. They don't care. This is only to assist tenants for the pandemic. It's not to assist income property owners, mom and pop owners.
Dennis, I think we're going to wrap it up. But
Okay.
before we wear you out and wear you down, we want to thank you very much for being here, answering the questions. If you have more questions, you can call Dennis's office at...
That's evict123.com. That's 1-800-77-EVICT, 1-800-77-EVICT, or my website is evict123.com.
Or you can call into the AOA office, and we have advisors that are on the phones right now, and they'll be able to answer any more questions that you have. Or if I did not answer a question that you think should have been asked, feel free to call either into the AOA to our advisors, property management advisors, or Dennis's office, and he'll be happy to do that. Go to the AOA website, please, right now, for your own protection. If ever you've seen you need protection from and you know what, I'm sorry, folks, pardon me, from these animals that are making the laws, taking away your property rights, today is the day. Go to the AOA website. Over at the left-hand side is the petition. Sign that petition and get the numbers up. We're over 30-some thousand signatures now. We need a lot more to get the governor's attention to let him know what our needs are on that. And we're asking for some moratoriums on our expenses on that particular petition. We'll be coming out with a petition number 2. With that, we're going to be asking the government to come out with to give the tenants the money to pay their rent, to give
Vouchers.
them. Pardon?
Vouchers.
Vouchers. I lost it. I get so angry at these guys. The vouchers, to give the government to give vouchers to the tenants so they can pay their rent. If that's happened, everything will continue to go well. You'll be able to pay all your bills. You'll be able to pay your mortgage. They won't have to go after the banks. The banks won't have to get involved. The tenant will feel better, I'm sure. He's going to rest easier. He'll be able to spend that money that the government's giving him to buy food for his kids and for himself. and everybody's going to be better off. And also, welfare is normally paid by everybody, by society. The welfare that the politicians are asking for now is from you, and you only for those families that you're responsible, that they've made you responsible for. They do not appreciate the housing that you've provided. That is very obvious. The laws are going to run builders out of this state to another state. They're going to run property housing providers out of the state. Why should you provide housing for people who don't appreciate it? For politicians who want to buy votes with your building. Sign the petitions, get them in, talk to your friends. Remember, toward the end of the year in November, we have even a bigger fight at that time to do, and let's all join together. Take these positions. If you belong to another association, ask that association, send this petition out there. Get all our members on board. Let's stop this thing. Let's send a message to the governor. If we get 100,000 signatures on there, the governor's going to say, oh, that's enough to throw me out of office. And so let's do something about it. I want to thank you for being here today, for being on the program. Look forward to more announcements. We will be having more programs like this to bring you up to date. And Dennis, thank you again very much for being here, and thank all of you for being on the line. What is it, Jeff? You want to?
Put it online later on.
Yes, it will be online on the website. We'll be offering it there in case you want to go over that again. You came in late, you missed the first part of it, and you'd like to catch it. We will be putting it up on the website. Thank you all very much, and have a great day.